You are about to enter the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast on shockwaveskullsessions.com. And now your host, Bob Nalbandian.
Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast. We got a great episode on something that I got tons of emails of people telling me, dude, you got to do something on power metal. So I believe two perfect guests to discuss power metal on this episode. We got our returning guest, and we can say Shockwave Skull Sessions regular, huh, Martin?
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
There you go. He doesn't mind. What's going on, Martin?
Oh, nothing much. Just kind of working away, packing up a lot of Rush books lately. Boy, that Rush book is selling almost too good. I'm spending all my time doing mail order.
Dude, I've been seeing that, man. You're going to have to steal from Amazon's workers and get them working for you. I'm sure you could pay them better.
Yeah, well, it's the one part of the business that's not broken, right? I mean, mail order is basically, it's kind of the one thing that's still alive. And unfortunately, that's what I'm spending a lot of my time on. Plus writing, but I'm not getting much time to write because, yes, I'm signing books and driving them up to my mail place all the time.
Wow, yeah, I've been seeing that. Huge buzz on that Rush book. And you got a couple other books. I know you still got the Ye Olde Metal series you kind of got in kind of a digital format now, or like I know didn't you do something on Holocaust and a bunch of different bands fairly recently?
Yeah. So I have ebook versions of those old Ye Olde Metal books. Plus, I've been writing some shorter documents and putting them out, so those aren't in print at all. But the main things that are happening right now is I also last week had a Saxon book out, or 3 weeks ago, and Merciful Fate book is recent, and then the three Maiden books. I'm in the middle of the third Maiden book, but I just can't get around to getting the thing finished. So that's the current stuff.
Yeah, dude, you are a book machine, I tell you. Right on. All right, and our second guest, we got Andy Dowling, an old friend of mine who I met back in, 2012, right, in Germany at the Headbangers Open Air Festival.
That's right. A bit of a hazy experience over in Germany, but it was a lot of fun. It was a pleasure to meet you, and obviously we've been friends ever since.
Absolutely. That was a great time, man. What a great festival. Lord, you guys absolutely kicked ass, and it was, I was there with the band Eden that I used to manage back in the 80s that kind of got back together, and Lizzie Borden was on the bill, Silver Mountain, Onslaught, a lot of great bands were on the bill, Vixen, a lot old school metal bill. So it was great to meet you there, and let's go ahead and get going, man. Power metal we're going to discuss here on this episode. To start off with, I'll kind of give you my perspective on power metal, and it's interesting how this became known as a genre. I remember back in the early 80s, there was always terms like power something, power rock, or high energy rock and roll was a big term everyone used back in the early 80s. It was like, don't call us metal, we're high energy rock and roll. Dante Fox, we play high energy rock and roll. And that was like the big thing in LA and in Orange County. And then I remember first time I heard power metal was actually Metallica had a demo tape which Ron McGovney named power metal. He actually made these business cards. Ron McGovney, Metallica's first bass player, the original Metallica demo tape was named after the business card that he made, and it was called the Power Metal Demo. And that was a 4-song demo before No Life Till Leather. And that was the first time I saw a band actually tag themselves as power metal. And before it was called speed metal, I believe Raven, maybe Martin could help me out here. I think Raven were one of the original bands called speed metal. Then it became all the thrash metal bands before the thrash metal moniker was discovered. People called themselves, Metallica and Megadeth. They were speed metal. And then it became, thrash metal, and power metal kind of got lost in the shuffle, and now it's kind of morphed into this kind of Halloween were one of the original bands that I think were dubbed power metal. I remember Sabotage way back in the day were called that, but it's interesting how it's become an actual genre. And now certain bands, like you had said, Andy, about people tagging you guys as power metal, and I know a lot of people take those monikers very serious. It's like, no, we're not power metal, we're symphonic power metal, or we're this kind of symphonic speed metal. It's funny, but how would you describe the music of Lord, Andy?
Yeah, I think we try to keep it really simple, which doesn't help the purists. But we say we're melodic metal, which is usually the easiest thing. But I think to make it easy for for people that are getting used to us, power metal is usually the safest place to start. I mean, as we will discuss in this chat, I mean, there's so many different niches and subgenres within the power metal world, where everything from symphonic to, you know, the US power metal wave that came through, which was a lot harder and had sort of those earlier speed metal elements, etc. So we've sort of encapsulated a lot of that stuff over the years. So we end up just being this heavy metal band that plays a bit of everything. But it always stumps me when someone asks exactly what we sound like. So as you guys have already discovered, listening to me trying to waffle on and explain myself, but let's keep it simple and say power metal for the sake of the podcast.
Right on. And Martin, I know you're quite an expert when it comes to the power metal term. I know you were featured on. Actually, you were involved in the making of the great Sam Dunn series on power metal. It was what was the series called again? Metal Evolution.
Yeah, we did it in Metal Evolution, and then we even did a later episode straight for YouTube on what did we call those ones where we did the episodes and moved stuff around? Overkill? No, I'm not sure. Anyways, we had a whole thing where we did a stand-up thing on basically power metal. But I mean, I don't know if I'm an expert on it, but I certainly, I guess, I'm a quasi-expert on the origins of it, I suppose, but I haven't kept up with. There's so many bands doing it now in so many different directions that, and that actually started probably, when we first started the magazine around 94, 95, that's when you really started getting the ramp up of lots and lots and lots of bands. Blind Guardian came into prominence,
sure.
but Gamma Ray and all the Halloween triumvirate of bands, right? And then
Primal Fear.
And then Hammerfall was the big one to kick it off even more. And then you had the Italian scene, and then there was all the debates about the symphonic metal from Nightwish through to soundtrack metal, Rhapsody, and the really melodic stuff like Stradivarius. So this is when all these bands like really came into prominence, and the whole idea then was this idea of reclaiming metal and reclaiming to be proud of metal again, almost like the first time that ever happened was the new wave of British heavy metal, and here they were doing it again at this time. And it was a very European thing. Iced Earth, God love them, held down the fort for America, essentially. Sure. And then there was just more and more and more, and I haven't really particularly kept up. But, I mean, if you want to go way back, and I'll just give you my quick little, and just stop me if I'm blabbing on here. But, I think obviously it starts with classical music. But moving forward, big leap forward, I would say Uriah Heep with Demons and Wizards, things like that. Sure. Heep does not get enough credence. And then, of course, because of the themes and the progginess and the high singing, I suppose, somewhat a little bit, the melody, the harmonies. But then, Bob, your favorite album of all time, of course, comes next. And then we've got Rainbow Rising, right? Right. So you go into Rainbow, and then I think basically at the same time you've got Priest. So it's speed, it's high vocals, it's technicality, it's guitar solos, right? And then basically you kind of move into the likes of a lot of new wave of British heavy metal bands, but in particular Maiden. And then, like you said, pretty much correctly, Halloween was always considered the snot-nosed upstart baby version, faster version of Iron Maiden. Right. So really, I remember when we did that episode for YouTube on power metal, and Manowar is in there as well.
I was going to say Manowar, one of the original ones called power metal. I forgot to mention. Yeah, and I think a lot of it was their look. They looked powerful.
Yeah, exactly. The look and the lyrics, but not so much the music. They had this weird clanky sort of music, right? But I remember, when we did that episode, we kind of came down on the idea that, Halloween is the one everybody mentions, but the other one that's pretty important for the very origins of actually like a fresh era, calling something power metal for the first time, is probably the second Yngwie album with, that was mostly vocals. What is it called? Not Marching Out, Yngwie.
With Jeff Scott Soto?
What's the second one called? Yeah. Yngwie Malmsteen's Rising Force. Anyways, that one with, I'll See the Light Tonight.
But was that considered power metal back then when that came out? Because that came out...
Well, no, I don't think so. I mean, the point is, I really, I loved your little explanation of where the term comes from, because I've always thought power metal was was not a good term for this kind of music. It is a better term for Metallica, and it is a better term for what Pantera was doing later when when they started calling. They had an album called power metal, right?
Yeah.
But no, I don't know when the term was particularly applied to what I call, jokingly sometimes frilly sleeves metal or ballerina metal, right?
Love it.
Anyways, I've babbled on enough. You bring me in again when you want, but go ahead.
I think that's a good point. It's when I mean, a lot of people would call themselves a certain style of music, but I think when it really became a genre is, like you said, with Halloween, it became known as this European thing. But obviously Manowar, I remember them labeled as power metal, not as a genre, but as describing their music and their look, and their lyrics was all very powerful. It was all about, like you said, it had that classical element, and it was just very powerful in sound and in appearance, and their live show, we're the loudest band in the world. It was all about being mega extra, giving it a notch above heavy metal. We're power metal. And then it became this European sound. And I think around, when Halloween started was around when the genre became labeled as that, and you mentioned bands like Hammerfall and, and then the more symphonic bands like Blind Guardian and stuff like that. And then it became kind of happy metal with bands like Sonatic Arctica, and, and even Stradivarius to an extent. It was, people thought, this genre sounds too happy, and even bands like Nightwish and all that. It wasn't mean and aggressive as the term originally, I think, started as power metal.
One other thing to mention just before I forget is that there's also that, there's that cool little area, when people later started calling this original American power metal true metal, right? Keep It True Festival.
Yes.
So I used to call that stuff poverty metal, and it was basically or working man or lunch bucket metal, the stuff basically 2/3 of the Metal Blade roster from sort of 83 through to 86, right?
Sure.
Those bands,
Tyrant and bands like that.
Obsession, and even Metal Church to some, Armored Saint is a perfect example.
Absolutely.
Even though they aren't a small band. I mean, they were on a major label, but they fit perfectly into that. I mean, look at the armor itself.
Exactly. And the look itself, their image was power metal.
So there's this American version of power metal that is housed in that era, and it's usually pretty poor bands and not great production, and they're on a shoestring kind of thing. But that's the stuff that later was in retrospect referred back to as true metal.
Right. Absolutely. Andy, what's your take on it? I mean, you started in 89, you said, is when the band was formed, right? So that was right around the cusp of when this, was kind of becoming known as a genre, or probably a little bit after. But what's your take on it, especially coming out of Australia?
Yeah, I think we were heavily influenced sort of in the late 80s by what was going on in the US market rather than anywhere else in particular. So the big bands that were sort of paying attention to a lot of the thrash movement that was happening in the 80s. But also some of the stuff leaning into the more progressive sphere, like Queensryche and even Savatage, which could be, as you said, Bob, was sort of at times labelled as a bit of a power metal band as well at particular times in their career.
Sure.
And then leaning into what we've been referring to, Halloween as well, in the European market, a lot of, and also bands like Leatherwolf as well.
Wow.
Where some the 3-guitar attack and these amazing harmonies and huge choruses, etc. So there's a lot of that sort of elements that sort of influenced the beginnings of what was Dungeon at the time and then eventually turned into Lord. And I think over the years, and one thing that I've noticed with power metal is that, especially with the term power, is that most of these bands, even though they all branched off and went in these different directions, whether it be symphonic or a bit more upbeat and happy or whatever it might be, is that they've got this underlying speed attached to it, where a lot of the origins, when we talk about early power metal, a lot of it comes from some element of guitar-driven speed, whether it be speed metal, straight up, or some of the older stuff, even the 70s stuff that Martin you were talking about has some, probably in comparison to what has come out in the last couple of decades, is probably quite slow, but at the time was very fast, aggressive guitar playing with melodic vocals, and I think that sort of underpinned a lot of what became power metal later on down the track. So as far as the term goes, I mean, I'm really leaning on you guys, and it's quite interesting to hear your perspectives as to where you saw the names or the terms pop up. But I guess when I listen to a lot of these bands, I always hear that common theme, whether it be Rhapsody, which is ultra cheesy and symphonic, but they've got this fast underlying guitar playing and double kick drums, etc., or even Nightwish, early Nightwish as well. A lot of those bands that sort of are very extreme in a different direction have still got that speed attached to it. And so for us, when we've always played, we've always had ridiculously fast guitars, lots of guitar solos, lots of big sing-along choruses, and obviously we've blended from the traditional guys such as Priest and Maiden, etc., but have definitely taken a note out of as many books as we can along the way to create what we do. And I think we've just always loved the melodic element of metal and try to beef it up as much as we can with fast guitars. And that's oversimplifying what we've done over the years, but it's probably a great way to sort of describe it.
Right on.
Yeah, that melodic aspect. I mean, that I remember now from the episode as well. We investigated a little bit this idea of Schlager music from, which is kind of this really cheesy poppy music from the history of Germany that was part of all this. That bleeds into the, when you try to review this stuff, everybody stumbles around terms like soccer, the soccer hauler or football hooligan chant. Kind of aspect to the vocals and stuff. And, one thing I also wanted to mention, we have to make sure that we pay homage to Ronnie James Dio in this big time because of what he brought to definitely the lyrics in Rainbow, first of all, not particularly Elf, but so that's the direct line from Heat. But then the Dio band itself is considered so much of a power metal originator. And Andy, very different to what you just described. It's like again, Dio's almost like the uptown version of the poverty metal or the American or the true metal thing. So it's a little more, little slower and thicker, but it's like traditional metal. So traditional metal is another thing that power metal gets, bled into somewhat. And in that, I mentioned earlier Metal Church, but also Accept, fall right into that whole thing. Sure. Even Gravedigger in the beginning. Gravedigger is like half thrash band, half power metal band in a way. So you don't, some of these bands, they fall out of the definition due to their vocals. And then there's a band like Queensryche who falls out of the definition. They're definitely in the definition on the EP, but then they start falling out of it the same way Fate's Warning is out of it into a progressive metal. So power metal, it's right next to progressive metal at the same time, right? So, there's all these spokes in the wheel that go off into various directions. You could be a thrashy power metal band, a progressive power metal band, a traditional power metal band. You could be all sorts. Nightwish. You can go even more classical in that direction. So yeah, it's definitely got a lot of origins and yeah, I just see these two kind of veins more than anything: the European one and the American one.
I think from our end, I mean, it's the biggest advantage, but also the biggest disadvantage that we've had over the years is being labelled or being put into the pigeonhole of a power metal band, because as you just explained, Martin, there's so many different elements and branches off that term where we could, when we're putting together an album, I mean, we love so many different metal bands. And so we go, well, what do we want to lean on? And so we'll do a thrash metal song. And then we'll do something that's very sort of, symphonic with a lot of orchestration. And then we'll do something that's a little bit heavier. And then we'll do something a little bit more mid-paced, which is a bit more traditional or true metal or whatever it might be. And it all comes under this power metal sort of label. But then the issue that we've always had, or the biggest challenge we've always had over the years, is being marketed as a power metal band. Because I think when you talk to a lot of people these days who probably aren't as familiar with the deep roots of the genre, they would probably lean towards what has been happening in Europe over the past couple of decades. And so I can't remember the terms that you used before, Martin, but we always used to use the term flower metal for a lot of this stuff because it was just this this pretty sort of upbeat symphonic sort of thing, very light sounding sort of music that was coming from parts of Europe. And so people would go, well, they're a power metal band, I don't want to listen to them. So it was an advantage where we had the versatility where we could do heaps of different things, as opposed to maybe like a death metal band where you're a little bit more streamlined, a little bit more restricted as far as what you can do. But at the same time, because we were so broad, it was very difficult to market what we were doing as well. So double-edged sword.
Yeah, for sure.
It's interesting you mentioned, the difference with a progressive, because you could say a band like Dream Theater, which is more power metal, especially the early Pull Me Under and all that kind of stuff. It definitely had very progressive elements, but it was heavy in almost in a Metallica sense. But a lot of it does come from, as you say, the early 70s bands, whether it's the symphonic metal of, Blind Guardian, Demons and Wizards, Symphony X, or Nightwish, or the happier bands like the Sonatica Arctica and Hammerfall, which is it sounds kind of light. It's happy power metal in a sense, as you mentioned, Andy. But you do go back to Ronnie James Dio, and you mentioned Rainbow Rising, Stargazer, Uriah Heep. And you can even go to say as far as Deep Purple with Fireball. I mean, that song is considered by some one of the first speed metal songs, but you could also say it's one of the first power metal songs in a sense that it's fast, heavy, and got that real aggressive kind of thing.
Hard Loving Man too, right?
Oh, absolutely, yeah, from In Rock, and So it's interesting how it, and obviously a lot of their influences go way back to Deep Purple, and a lot of people obviously credit Iron Maiden, especially when Power Slave came out. I think that was a definite force in where it became a little bit more progressive with longer songs, and Dickinson's very symphonic vocals on that album, and I think that's kind of the roots to power metal. Then I think as you guys said, Halloween kind of took the torch with it, and I think that's when the genre. It's interesting how the genres are labeled. If it's from a journalist or from a record company to market it, but like I said, as before it would just that band Matador, they're like power metal, and then it all of a sudden became this genre, and you had all these subgenres, as you say, Andy. Progressive power metal, symphonic power metal came about.
Yeah, and we also have to emphasize again. I mean, I mentioned it, but Iron Maiden is super important in this, just for all of those themes, the historical themes, the war themes, the literature themes, right? Because that's all a power metal trope. The twin leads, that the operatic singing of Bruce, the fairly fast songs, one or two per album, right? So Maiden are kind of like that link in the chain between the 70s and Halloween, I suppose, more than anybody.
And it's interesting, Andy, how you say it could really kind of, the term could hurt a band in a way where, whether it be magazines or fans, consider yourselves, they're a power metal band, and instantly people think, oh, power metal, they must sound like this European kind of very melodic, happy power metal, or they'll have their own view of what power metal is. It's they'll kind of pigeonhole you in a certain way. Has that cursed you a lot, Andy?
I think it's hurt us a little bit when it comes to labels. I think labels love to have a nice, clean, clear understanding of what the band sounds like, so they can market it, which makes sense. It's good business, but for us, I mean, going back to what I said before, like or what you just mentioned, Bob, it's like people will go, well, I'm not going to listen to them because I don't like power metal and the vision of what I think power metal is. But then on the flip side, you'll have somebody who thinks power metal is that, loves that sort of stuff, and then listens to us and goes, well, this is not Sonata Arctica, or this is not Stradivarius, and this is not what I like. It's too hard, or it's too fast, or whatever it might be. It's not sort of in line with what my expectations of power metal is. And so we would go and shop an album and with some of the, especially European labels in particular, and they were like, well, we really don't know what to market you guys as. And we just say, look, can you just call us a heavy metal band? And even that comes with a bit of baggage as well. So it's a bit of a challenge. I mean, but I think that's, for us, I mean, we've always sort of been a bit of a DIY band, which is why we sort of only got to the level that we have over the years. And we've been able to sort of really sort of carve out a bit of a niche ourselves. But we've always had those challenges when we speak to the industry and try and get that sort of support, because from a marketable point of view, I mean, mind you, these days, I mean, if you think about some of the other European bands that are coming out, like Sabaton, Powerwolf, some of those harder sort of, they've got power metal elements, but they're more heavier and sort of, they've got a bit more grit attached to them, and probably leaning a little bit more on the US stuff as well, guitar-wise. Maybe we're a little bit more marketable than we used to be, because in the 90s, Dungeon was on Limb in Europe.
Oh, yeah.
We had just an absolute nightmare dealing with them, because they really wanted to turn us into like an Italian power metal band, and we just sounded nothing like it. And so there was a lot of tension between band and label to try and work out, well, what the hell are we? It's always been a challenge, but I mean, we at the same time we kind of like it as well. I mean, it's a very Australian thing in our culture to be the underdog. And so we always love a challenge, and to be to always sort of be fighting for recognition or reward or whatever it might be. So we've always sort of embraced it and taken a lot of pride in just doing what we do. And if we get a win and we get to the right people and the right people listen to us, then it's fantastic. And we just keep doing what we do. So we always try to look at the silver lining of it all.
Yeah, I guess the other big problem with it, you were mentioning being stigmatized at it, is there's a lot of relying on the tropes of like illustration and fantasy illustration for the cover arts of power metal albums, right? So that usually paints a certain picture and reinforces those characteristics, right?
Absolutely.
And as I was saying, there was an exponential growth after, it was, as Bob mentioned, in the late 90s. I mean, Hammerfall was this fresh thing, and they kind of got all the press and sucked all the oxygen out of the room. But Primal Fear, right there, they were very prolific, put out a lot of stuff, and they did pretty well. But the records just kept coming and coming and coming, and if you're when you're not the first on the block with something, as was Hammerfall. I mean, that Hammerfall was dropping right into this climate of just hating everything to do with metal. Everything to do with metal is embarrassing. Hair metal had gone by, grunge had gone by. It was kind of hard alternative and industrial and just straight alternative music at that time. And, every metal band was grousing about how bad their sales were. And Hammerfall comes in and says, we are unapologetically metal, just like in 1979 with Priest, with Hellbent for Leather, and Take on the World, and Unleashed in the East, and British Steel, and United, right? Hammerfall was that band kind of again in 95, 96, whenever it was, Glory to the Brave and all that, right? And then I remember now just thinking the other little blip of excitement was the arrival of Dragon Force, right? You had a band out of the UK, which was odd because UK had basically sat out this whole thing. There had been others along. We remember pirate metal, Ailstorm and all that.
Right.
Yeah. So you had pirate metal's a branch of this. Folk metal is a little bit a branch of this. But Dragon Force, I remember, were getting all those, they were in all the guitar magazines and all the technical stuff and the clinics and all that. And so there was a buzz around them. But then the buzz kind of wore off again. And I guess Sabaton, Andy, as you mentioned, was a bit of a bright spot again, right? Amon Amarth, you can almost say, I mean, they've had a lot of success.
True.
They aren't exactly a power metal band, but there's these
power
little
death metal.
There's these percentages of them that kind of fit to a power metal crowd anyways, right? But yeah, Sabaton was a big one, definitely a pretty well respected band or well received band that was doing this all anew. So yeah, it's funny. It just seemed like there was too much of a glut there for a little bit of time, but all those bands did quite well. I mean, Blind Guardians had a great career, right?
Huge
doing this, yeah. So a lot of these bands, even though practically none of them broke over here, you could say Nightwish somewhat, right? But basically none of them broke over here. But everybody had just a perfectly fine career all over Europe. I mean, it must be hard being from Australia and not being constantly, literally spending months and months all the time in Europe, for example, right? Yeah, as would bands like Iced Earth and Manowar, they would just go over the ocean and spend a lot of time in Europe, right? So even American power metal bands could have somewhat of a life just based on their European situations. So yeah, I don't know.
I was going to say, how is it being in Australia? Has it been a bit of a struggle? Because I don't know of many power metal bands from Australia.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's funny because we've always been isolated, and it's only been in sort of the last 10 or so years where the internet sort of got to a point now where it's just so easy to connect with everybody like we're doing right now. And I think what we did just as a necessity is we created our own scene. We just created our own little isolated scene down here in the arse end of the world, and started making up bands that were inspired by what was going on in Europe and the US. So we've got a really great sort of history of fantastic bands in Australia, but unfortunately the common theme with a lot of them is that the success that they got outside of Australia is quite limited in places. And it's only been sort of in the last several years that a lot more Australian bands are starting to get a lot of worldwide recognition, I should say, and get the credit they deserve. But I mean, some of the bands that sort of came from our neck of the woods were bands like Vanishing Point, Black Majesty, I Fear, Pegasus as well.
Oh yeah,
they were on Nuclear Blast, I think, in the mid to late 90s, I think. We've also got some newer bands like Voyager, who have gone more sort of progressive, djent sort of metal now, but sort of their earlier stuff was far more power metal-ish. Darker Half, Espionage, Silent Night, Tabra. So a lot of bands that maybe a lot of the international listeners may not know of, or may have only seen the name. But here in Australia, we've just got a really, I mean, it's probably the benefit of having quite a small scene, is that we all sort of try and pick each other up and support each other. And we've got just a nice little small healthy scene. But as far as trying to get outside and get the rest of the world paying attention to what we do, it's it's always been a challenge, but we kind of just take that in our stride and keep going. And I mean, that's just melodic metal. Of course, if we went off on a tangent and talked about all sorts of other genres of metal in particular, there's just so many bands that have done really well internationally in the last several years. So it's we've tried to not let the distance these days be a reason why we can't succeed. But maybe years gone by, and just purely because we didn't have the connectivity that we do now, it was a legitimate reason why bands were just not lasting or not having the success that some of our friends in North America or Europe were getting.
And you mentioned something interesting, Martin, about the artwork, and I think that has a lot to do with most of these bands, considered in the power metal realm, do have similar artwork, and it does go back to like Rainbow Rising or Demons and Wizards, and the 70s artwork, and then you had all the Dio records, the Dragons and Yngwie with the Trilogy record, and all the other bands that followed, all had that cartoonish kind of animated dragons and wizards kind of artwork in there.
Taken to the extreme on the Christian metal album covers, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
But you're right about Hammerfall. I mean, a lot of people don't give that band credit. I mean, as huge as power metal has got all over Europe, and bands like Sabaton, I know, are absolutely huge, and Hammerfall, I don't know if they're still very huge, but in the late 90s and early 2000s, they ruled Europe. And of course, you had Manowar that were always, kings in Europe. But Hammerfall, when they started in the, like you said, in the mid 90s, it was a sound that was not, it was new to everyone. And like you said, they really took a risk, and they went through they were underdogs and saying, hey, look, we are traditional metal. We're going to stick to our roots. We're not going grunge. We're not going alternative. We are proud of being traditional metal. So, whether you like that music or not, you got to respect that, because that really started this whole genre of what became considered power metal.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, it's a little bit of a guilty pleasure, and I can picture, the guys in Hammerfall or any of these guys in Norway or Finland or Sweden. Like, this is the kind of music. I mean, in its extreme, you can think of black metal guys listening to, because I've seen this in person, like, Love and AC/DC and listening to It's a Long Way to the Top or whatever. But I mean, I can see a lot of guys on the bus, the music you would listen to for pleasure, being those early power metal albums, of your youth, of whether it's the late 70s or early 80s or whatever. Iron Maiden, these are in a way, these are bands that are guilty pleasures due to their melody and accessibility versus what you're actually playing in a more extreme metal band, right? So some these guys, this came to mind because I can think of so many times when these more extreme bands would do a cover on a tribute album, or do their own, covers album, or play a cover on their own album or whatever. It, generally they will go to an old power metal classic, right? So there is this idea of this being music that is hooky. It's very accessible. It's got earworms. The choruses are very anthemic. So it's music in a metal realm that's basically easy to love. But is it too easy to love sometimes? Is it too saccharine? Is it just like does it give you a stomach ache because it's junk food, right?
That was always a challenge with us in Australia, where we've had a predominantly thrash metal, death metal, black metal scene. A lot of the sort of more extreme sort of genres of metal, and Dungeon in particular, I mean, was, we had some traditional heavy metal bands in Australia, but Dungeon was probably one of the first bands that sort of really started to include elements of what we sort of, using air quotes, power metal elements, especially European tinges, especially with Halloween and things like that. But there wasn't a lot of bands like Dungeon at all. So when you played shows, you had to play shows with death metal bands and black metal bands and whatever. And so, and we found it right up until recently as well, is that sometimes we'll get on a really odd bill of really heavy bands, and we stick out like a sore thumb. And you watch the crowd, who are predominantly extreme metal fans, and they're all standing there with their arms crossed in their favorite Scandinavian black metal t-shirts, and they're watching us, and then we start playing, and they don't move too much, but by the end of the set, they're starting to nod their head and go, "Oh, this is actually not bad." Yeah. And I think what you said, Martin, was a lot of these guys grew up on bands like Maiden and Priest and even AC/DC and things like that, where there's some sing-along choruses, there's some melodic elements to the music, and it's still got that sort of masculine heaviness to that sound as well. And so, I mean, we've done some odd ones. Dungeon supported Mayhem on the first Australian tour. Wow. And that was the most ridiculous pairing. And the guys actually thought that they were going to get lynched on stage because of it. But it went down a treat. And even today, people still talk about that particular show and just how odd the lineup was, but how it just worked. Yeah. And it's just one of those things where I think we sometimes feel that people will just not give us the time of day. And it's probably like the Hammerfall thing, where they're coming onto the scene and probably coming face to face with a lot of heavier bands in Europe at least, and they just got to stand up and go, we're proud of what we do, and this is what we're going to do, and if you come along, fantastic. If you don't, then that's cool. And we've always had the same sort of mentality, where it's like, we'll just stand up and enjoy what we do and be proud of it, and you get quite surprised along the way of who actually turns around and goes, actually, you guys aren't that bad after all. I might actually listen to you a bit more.
Yeah, and I could picture like people in some grim black metal band looking at a Hammerfall going, "Wow, man, that looks like a lot of fun. I wish I could do that, but I can't, right? Because I have to maintain this serious level and I have to be cool, right?"
It's funny because I think in Europe, I've always said in Europe, people are so much more open-minded. I mean, you look at the festivals, the Sweden Rock or the Wacken or all these different festivals they have throughout Europe, and they will have a wide variety of artists, from black metal to death metal to symphonic metal to power metal, to a band like Europe, all on the same bill. I mean, you couldn't get away with that in America. I don't know about, you mentioned in Australia how you've done shows with that. Canada might be a little bit more open-minded, but here in America, I couldn't see that happening. But in Europe, I think that's kind of the cool thing about some of these European festivals. And it seems like the crowd is pretty open. They're, back in the day, obviously in the early 80s, you always heard about, Castle Donington or Reading Festival in England, where they would throw piss bottles at you if they didn't like you or whatever. But I think it's a lot more open now, where people are pretty accepting of, it's like, it's all about being metal. If you're a metal band, it doesn't matter. And I think there's a lot more respect too for like you'll see a lot of these 80s metal bands like a Triumph or bands like that that'll play, Sweden Rock or wherever, and people will have a lot of respect for them because, like as you said, Andy, a lot of these guys grew up on these 80s hard rock and metal bands.
Actually, just to give a shout out, something you mentioned there, we have to mention Europe. I've got a podcast called History in 5 Songs with Martin Popoff, and I did an episode on the new wave of Swedish heavy metal, right? And those bands like Europe, that first Europe album is just a classic. It's just
unbelievable, yeah.
But Europe, Torch, Overdrive, Silver Mountain, Axe Witch, all those guys.
Love it.
essentially, we used to, as kids, call that stuff frostcore,
Right.
Because it had this cold, chilly, Swedish, very European, very classical, very mournful sort of melodies in that stuff. And so that I think is also another important part of the roots of power metal right there.
It's funny. I always thought it was odd because I was a huge fan of Swedish early metal. It was very melodic, very classy. And by the way, Europe's first album was not the Final Countdown, so that's not what we're talking about. It's their first self-titled record. But all those bands you mentioned there, they had such a great classy sound, great musicianship, fantastic guitar players, whether, Jonas Hansen or, John Norum or, Yngwie. Just brilliant musicianship all around. And it's funny how Sweden was always known as this melodic metal, and Norway to an extent too, with bands like TNT in the early 80s. And then in the late 90s, it turned over to hardcore death metal in Sweden and black metal in Norway. And it just turned like that.
I think parts of Europe that I mean, just from my travels over there over the years and just looking at a lot of documentaries and stuff that you've been involved with, Martin, as far as, getting pieces of history together when it comes to metal, is that I just see Europe as a place collectively where metal was embraced. I think especially particular parts of Europe that were a little bit more locked down due to political, regimes and things like that. And, especially in the 80s when parts of the European continent started to open up, this music was sort of, a bit of a liberation for a lot of people. And so I think the way that a lot of European countries took on metal as a form of music was just that it was music, and it was really, really accepted as something that could be mainstream. And so that's why I think, as you said, Bob, you go to a festival in Europe and one band after the other is just polar opposites, and you're just going, how the hell does this work? But then you look around the crowd and everyone's just super happy, super accepting, open-minded, and just willing to get into it. And I think that just comes from a cultural thing over there where they've really been excited about Western music, embraced a lot of this stuff in the 80s. And even going back to, I'm pretty sure it was one of the Iron Maiden documentaries, not Flight 666, but one of the history ones that they were doing. And there's a scene, and they're somewhere in Europe, and Bruce is talking to a fan. It's like mid-80s, so it's probably around, I don't know, Peace of Mind or something like that. And this European fan says something about keyboards or synthesizers, and Bruce Dickinson just says, "No way! You got to be joking." And then not long after that, they bring out Somewhere in Time.
Yeah.
And obviously Seventh Son, etc. And it becomes this, orchestrated sort of sound that comes in. I mean, they're already doing, as we said, sort of power metal-ish lyrical themes and epic songs, but they sort of took it another step up. And it was just really funny, the timing of this particular conversation that was in this documentary, because it sort of led into then the next era of this band. But it was all sort of Europe just going, hey, how about you do this? And being really open-minded about just embracing music in general.
We didn't really dwell on that, but you're right. Keyboards is another big trope of power metal.
Exactly.
Keyboardists are allowed in power metal, and that's Jens from Stradivarius is big there.
Yeah,
and you even think of maybe it's that actual keyboard riff in Europe in Final Countdown that caused the whole thing, right?
Yeah. It really is a rabbit hole, just like any genre of metal, to be honest. You sort of just start digging and digging. So, the only other thing I sort of wrote down was just some of the, I guess, from a US point of view, is that there's quite a few recent and younger guys that are coming up in sort of this sort of power metal movement, this US power metal movement as well, which is quite exciting.
Who are some of the newer US power metal bands? I know of, obviously, like you mentioned, Iced Earth and Symphony X, but I hear a lot of people are talking about a new breed of power metal coming out of the U.S.
Yeah, I've seen. We were lucky to play Prog Power USA in 2016 in Atlanta, and they've always been a great little festival to showcase what's happening in sort of the progressive and power metal spheres, whether it be in the US or bringing bands over from Europe or even dragging us up from Australia. But there's bands that I've discovered through that festival that there's these little communities of growing fan bases in US, like Mind Maze and Judicator, Hellion Prime, Seven Kingdoms, A Sound of Thunder, Unleash the Archers from Canada as well. And they've all got sort of power metal elements to them. Some of them have got a little bit more of a harsher sort of sound or edge to them. But I was just amazed. I just that there's this wave of newer bands that are coming through in the last 5 or 10 years that are all relatively young people and just embracing all the bands that we've been speaking about for the last hour or so. It's just it's really, really cool to see sort of it happening somewhere else, not just in Europe. It's and so it's good to see North America sort of taking the torch again.
There is that little pocket of a type of power metal band that is a sub movement where they're essentially re-celebrating the new wave of British heavy metal. So just like, you know, there was hair metal, and then what I often call dirty hair metal, which starts with Guns N' Roses and moves into Skid Row and Badlands and Love Hate. You could almost say that these revivalists of the new wave of British heavy metal are more like a dirty power metal thing. So it's a little scrappier, a little speedier, could be a little rougher on the vocals. So it's a little closer to speed metal, maybe a little bit of thrash. But essentially, it's almost like a retro power metal, back to the cherry picking from the new wave of British heavy metal stuff that was a little more like that. I mean, Tigers of Pantang from the new wave of British heavy metal could often be called pretty close to Maiden in terms of, you know, those two bands probably are the two biggest bands that could be considered fairly power metal, right? And then look at bands like, you know, you think of, oh, who else was big in the new wave of British heavy metal? Well, there was Saxon. They were not power metal at all then, but their last 10 albums have been basically squarely in that American pure or true metal, power metal sense. So Accept right now and Saxon sound fairly similar to each other, and they're actually sounding a lot more power metal than they even did in the early days.
Yeah. Well, even the album Power and the Glory, that's, you know, got that power metal kind of anthemic. And then Crusader, it had the artwork and the song Crusader, big epic kind of keyboard-ish. That would definitely be considered power metal if it had come out today. But interesting about all those new bands. I'm not familiar with many of them. I know there's a lot of these U.S. bands that are coming out, which kind of have that new wave of British heavy metal sound, which are called the new wave of traditional American metal.
Yeah.
I've heard that tag before. But as you mentioned, Andy, I forgot about that big festival they have in Atlanta, which is all, you know, dedicated to power and prog metal. And I know there's a lot of these festivals coming out. I think there's even a prog metal cruise or power metal cruise that they do. And I mean, it's become a very, very huge genre of music.
I think it's just inspired that next wave of metal fans. Like, I mean, I've met people at those festivals who have just travelled every year to go and listen to bands that they never thought they'd ever be able to see live. And that was one of the beauties of what Glenn and Milton and Nathan were doing at Prog Power, but also to meet bands that haven't been on the festival yet, but are just coming to sort of, you know, promote their stuff. I mean, there's another band, I think, from Madison, Wisconsin called Lords of the Trident, and they're totally embracing the whole knights in armor and all that sort of stuff, which is, you know, can be ultra cheesy, but it's really, really fun metal. But they come to Prog Power every year to network and to get inspired by what's being showcased every year. And even what you said, Martin, with the sort of that next wave of sort of that traditional heavy metal and stuff that's come from, you know, from Britain as well. I mean, you got bands in the US like I think Paladin. I think they're sort of like a bit of a thrashier sort of sound, but also Widow, which I think are from North Carolina, I think. And there's just this really cool next wave of people where festivals like Prog Power are sort of giving the opportunity for younger people to go, hey, this music is actually really cool. Why don't I try and start my own band and see what I can do? And it's awesome, and it just keeps these genres alive, even though it's like the second wave or the third wave or the fifth wave or whatever it might be. It's still got the same ingredients.
Right on. Well, in closing, where do you guys see the future of power metal? A lot of people thought it was going to be kind of, you know, like you said, when all these bands, you know, Hammerfall, Primal Fear, all that, they thought, these bands aren't going to last more than one or two records. But it's obviously carried on, become huge. You know, as we mentioned, bands like Sabaton, all these other bands, they're headlining, you know, arenas and places like that all over Europe. Manowar's still mega huge, obviously. You know, there's been all these other offshoots, as we mentioned, symphonic power metal, progressive power metal. Where do you see the future of power metal? We'll start with you, Martin.
Well, I think it really will be kept alive because of the enthusiasm for the chops of it. I mean, basically, it's great singers, great guitarists, great bass players, you know, double bass drumming, tricky time signatures, cool arrangements, keyboards. So there's a lot for players to stay excited about. And I've always said that, every genre that comes along, it never dies. There's always lots and lots of stuff, more albums all the time. In this day and age when basically live shows may not be happening for a long time or ever again, or who knows. I think one of the great things that power metal is situated in is because it's lyrically and image-wise pretty substantive, that I think a lot of these bands can have big mail order businesses. Mail order is on my mind right now, and I've been telling a lot of bands and managers of bands who are fretting about all this. It's like, raise your mail order game. And I think power metal is perfectly situated for things. I've been telling people, people got to start putting out illustrated lyric books and things like that, right? Mm-hmm. And I think there's just a lot of cool stuff that power metal bands could do over and above other bands to basically come up with more products and to push their mail order.
Merchandise is a huge thing with power metal bands, as you mentioned, and usually because of their great artwork. They have really cool artwork, and people love to. Even in the 90s, I was seeing young kids in the late 90s with, Hammerfall shirts and Iced Earth shirts, and, it's become like the next step of the, Iron Maiden shirts, with Eddie. It's they're very proud to wear that. So, as you say, is a big thing, is the artwork and the merchandise is definitely all you power metal bands take advantage of. I know you have a pretty big merchandise section. I was just on your website, Andy. What's your views on not just the future of power metal, but as Martin talks about merchandising?
Merchandising, I'm always scratching or searching around for the next idea to capitalize on. We're really good at selling merch via mail order, and we're really lucky. I think one of the things about sort of the people that listen to our music, if you're thinking from a marketing point of view and you're trying to stereotype your typical fan, people that listen to our music and a lot of these bands that we've been speaking about are real music purists. They're enthusiasts. They really care about the music, and they're probably people that grew up maybe in the 70s or the 80s, bought records or CDs, and they still really love the tangible aspect of it all. And so for us, we sell. Our last album came out last year, and we sold more CDs on that album than we have in years. And it just completely is the opposite of what is going on in the industry overall. And obviously merchandise, T-shirts and things like that are always a big money maker and really popular with people as well. And yeah, it comes down to the visual aspect and how it's represented. And you can't half-ass that. You can't. That was one thing that I always noticed in the early 2000s when CGI became this big, amazing thing, and everyone started embracing Photoshop. And there was some of the worst album covers of all time that came out in the early 2000s by a lot of great, big legacy bands just making a stab at trying to be, futuristic or whatever with their art. It was just dialed in, horrible looking CGI. And I think now in the last few years, bands have started to go back and go, you know what, there's a lot of importance on art, even though streaming's really, really popular, and in a lot of cases is a stronger option than the tangible CD or vinyl. It has to be a massive element to what you do. So yeah, we've always embraced that, and we continue to make that a big focus of what we do as a band, because we're a business in a way. We've got to look at ourselves like that. But with power metal, I think it might be a bit unfair to say this, but I think there's a real sort of element of nerd culture that's associated with power metal, whether it be the lyrical themes, the way that it's visualized, the presentation, etc. And it sort of blends into your Comic-Con crowd, sci-fi crowd, people that really love that sort of nerdy sort of sci-fi sort of culture. And I think because of that, there will always be a market and a really strong market for power metal, because it just really sort of scratches the itch for a lot of those people that love collecting things, that love the mythology or the fantasy elements and things like that. And I think that will always ensure that bands that lean heavily into that will always be quite successful.
Absolutely. Martin, why don't you talk about the things you got going on? You mentioned the History in 5 Songs podcast, which is a fantastic podcast. I highly recommend everyone check that out. And you've got many books, and I'm just seeing here on your website, you've now got paintings. So I didn't realize you were a painter as well. What don't you do, Martin?
Yeah, those I did way back in the 90s, but I've been doing some really weird stuff and basically imagining and doing color versions of black and white record ads and doing Led Zeppelin ads and saying, what if we stuck some cool imagery? It's a long story, but I've been doing a lot of drawing, and actually I've done some drawings for, I mentioned earlier, illustrated lyric books. We'll see if those come out. But no, it's mostly the books. I do want to do more art. But yeah, I do have the podcast, History in 5 Songs with Martin Popoff. We've got a YouTube show called The Contrarians that I do. So that's a video and audio, obviously, a YouTube show where, there's two guys and one guy, believes the greatest album by this band is an odd choice and he has to argue it. And then, martinpopoff.com for all the books. Basically, any book that is in print, I have a supply in my office and I sign them and sell them out of the office here. That's probably a big part of my income. So that's martinpopoff.com. There's PayPal buttons there for international, US and Canada. And like I say, I sign them and send them out all from here, and that's about it.
All right. And that Contrariums, that is Banger Films, correct? You could
No, actually there is all the Banger Film stuff too. So I'm on Overkill Rewind, Overkill Unearthed. I do regular reviews for Banger as well. So you could probably dial up about 15 or so different segments I've been on there, including the one where we do a poll and find the top 5 albums of a certain year. I've done 5 or 6 of those.
I love those.
No, Contrarians is myself and a few buddies, and we film it right here in the office. We just actually did an episode of a new thing we're trying where we did something by Zoom, a slightly different thing. But yeah, I'm kind of all over YouTube with these little things. And then the podcast, we're up into 46 episodes. New episode just came out today, which is called The Foreigner Effect, where I look at, basically I pick 5 little song segments and come up with a theme and make an argument based on these five songs.
Dude, you are the busiest man in heavy metal. I gotta tell you. Of course, you got the latest Rush book, Anthem. You got Denim and Leather by Saxon, Black Funeral, Into the Coven with Merciful Fate. Great book. Satisfaction, the 10 albums that changed my life. You recently put out, of course, Holy Smoke. That's your third Maiden book, right? The Holy Smoke?
Yeah, well, technically, what is it? I think it's third, but it's second of a series where I'm taking everything I've written on Maiden that, most of it's out of print now, and basically writing standard books. So there's Where Eagles Dare. The middle one, Holy Smoke, is sold out. But the third one is going to be called Empire of the Clouds, Iron Maiden in the 2000s, and that's about 3/4 finished. I might reactivate Holy Smoke when I activate the third one. But basically, there'll be a trilogy of these Maiden books.
All right. And to get everything on Martin Popoff, just go to martinpopoff.com. That is martinpopoff.com. You can check out all his books there, his podcasts, and even his paintings, as well as your ebooks and audiobooks. So definitely go there. And Andy, what do you got going on with Lord? You've got a new release coming out. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, we put out our last album in 2019, in August, and we've got our third single that's going to be coming out soon. We haven't announced anything yet, but stay tuned for that one. Lord.net.au is the place to go and check it all out. We've got a pretty sort of busy website there with lots of stuff to check out. But the last album, Fallen Idols, has just gone really well for us. Probably we hit the mainstream charts in Australia for the first time ever, which was crazy for a band that worships some of these bands that we've been speaking about in the Australian market, which has never really sort of embraced metal in the mainstream. It's been really good to sort of get that kind of recognition. Some new stuff that'll be coming soon from us, and then just my podcast as well. So I've just been doing Andy Social for the past few years, got 200+ episodes, and you've been on it, Bob, and Martin, I'll no doubt twist your arm at some stage in the future as well. See if you want to come on for a chat. Sure. But it's been a great way to sort of broaden the horizons and speak to a lot of fantastic people, and you can go to andydowling.net as well, and that's my little world and everything I'm involved with.
All right, andydowling.net, DOWLING, or you could go to lord.net.au. fantastic podcast, guys. And one thing I got to mention about both you guys, I love the fact that, Martin, you do self-publishing. You publish your books yourself. And, of course, Andy, the last several albums, Lord albums you put out, were all self-released on your own label, which, I find very rewarding.
About half of mine are self-published, and the other half are through there's probably been 10 or 12 different publishers. But yeah, I do a lot of it. I basically, if I don't even want to think about how to get a book deal on a band like Riot or Accept or Max Webster or Blue Oyster Cult, I'll just do it myself. But I mean, the Rush books through a big publisher, and all those Voyager books and stuff like that. But yeah, I love self-publishing. I can basically do as well at that as going through a publisher. So
absolutely. Well, appreciate you both coming on the podcast, and we will definitely be in touch very soon.
Thanks again, guys. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Okay, talk to you later.
Thank you for listening to the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast. Subscribe and listen to all episodes by going to our pages on iTunes, Spreaker, YouTube, Spotify, and more. You can listen to all other episodes and access up-to-date information and news on the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast by going to our website at www.shockwaveskullsessions.com. Email all comments, questions, and suggestions to shockwaveskullsessions@gmail.com.